The morning of December 14th, 1944, began like any other test flight day at Lockheed's Modification Center in Burbank, California. Major Signer Gilkey, a 28-year-old Army Air Forces test pilot, sat in the cockpit of a P-38 Lightning, serial number 4-2-13679. The twin-engine fighter gleamed in the weak winter sunlight, its distinctive twin-boom design and central nacelle giving it the silhouette that had earned it the nickname Fork-Tailed Devil among Luftwaffe pilots who encountered it over Europe and North Africa. Gilkey was not preparing for combat. His mission that morning was far more mundane on paper. A high-altitude performance evaluation of a modified P-38 Jules equipped with new dive recovery flaps. The aircraft had been experiencing troubling reports from combat theaters. Pilots were describing violent shaking, loss of control, and in some cases, structural failure during high-speed dives. Lockheed needed data. Gilkey would provide it. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. He taxied down the runway and lifted off, climbing steadily into the clear California sky. His flight plan called for reaching 35,000 feet, then entering a controlled dive to test the aircraft's behavior at speeds approaching its theoretical limits. The engineers on the ground expected useful information about buffeting and control response. What they would get instead was something no one had anticipated: the first documented encounter between a manned American aircraft and a phenomenon that would reshape aviation forever. The central irony of that December morning was this. In attempting to solve a problem that threatened the P-38's effectiveness as a fighter, Gilkey would inadvertently stumble into a realm of flight that physicists had warned might be impossible to survive. The sound barrier, as it was already being called in research circles, was not merely a speed to be exceeded. It was understood as a wall, a physical boundary where the laws of aerodynamics as pilots knew them would cease to function. Some theorists believed that aircraft approaching the speed of sound would simply disintegrate, torn apart by forces no structure could withstand. Gilkey knew none of this in explicit terms. He was a test pilot, not a physicist. His job was to fly the airplane, record what happened, and bring it back to Earth intact. The engineers at Lockheed had not briefed him on transonic aerodynamics or compressibility effects. They wanted dive data. He would give them far more than they bargained for. As he climbed through 20,000 feet, leveling off briefly to check his instruments, Gilkey had no way of knowing that within the next 15 minutes he would experience accelerations and aerodynamic forces that would push him closer to the speed of sound than any pilot in an American military aircraft had ever gone. He had no way of knowing that his P-38, a fighter designed for traditional aerial combat, would become an accidental research vehicle for exploring the most dangerous frontier in aviation. And he certainly had no way of knowing that his decisions in the next few minutes, made in the screaming chaos of an uncontrolled dive, would help unlock the secrets that would eventually allow humanity to routinely break the sound barrier. The question that morning, unspoken but present in every test flight, was simple. What happens when you push an aircraft beyond what its designers intended? Gilkey was about to find out. To understand what happened to Major Gilkey that morning requires understanding the Lockheed P-38 Lightning itself, a fighter that represented both the brilliance and the limitations of American aircraft design in the early 1940s. The P-38 was born from a 1937 Army Air Corps requirement for a high-altitude interceptor capable of reaching speeds of at least 360 miles per hour at 20,000 feet and climbing to that altitude in 6 minutes. These were extraordinary demands for the era. Conventional single-engine fighters could not meet them with existing engine technology. Lockheed's solution was radical. Use 2 engines. The twin-boom configuration placed a 1,200 horsepower Allison V17-10 engine in each boom, driving counter-rotating propellers to eliminate torque effects. The pilot sat in a central nacelle between the booms, with the aircraft's armament, 4 50-caliber machine guns, and 1 20mm cannon, concentrated in the nose. This clustering of guns, all firing straight ahead with no need for convergence angles, gave the P-38 devastating firepower. The design worked brilliantly in many respects. P-38 seconds served with distinction in every theatre of the Second World War. In the Pacific, they escorted B-17 bombers on the long raid that killed Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto in April of 1943. Major Richard Bong and Major Thomas Maguire, America's two highest-scoring aces, both flew P-38 seconds, accumulating 40 and 38 kills respectively. The aircraft's range, twin-engine reliability over water, and heavy armament made it ideal for the vast distances of the Pacific War. But the P-38 had a problem, one that became increasingly apparent as the war progressed and combat tactics evolved. In high-speed dives, particularly from altitudes above 25,000 feet, the aircraft exhibited dangerous characteristics. Pilots reported that as speed increased in a dive, the control column would begin to shake violently. The nose would tuck downward uncontrollably, steepening the dive beyond what the pilot intended. Attempts to pull out would be met with control forces so heavy that even a strong man pulling with both hands on the yoke could not raise the nose. The aircraft would continue diving, accelerating, until either the pilot managed to regain control at lower altitude where the air was denser, or the airframe failed under the stress. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Several pilots had died in these incidents. Crash investigators found wreckage patterns consistent with structural failure, wings or tail surfaces separated in flight, aircraft disintegrating under loads they should theoretically have been able to withstand. The problem was serious enough that by late 1944, tactical doctrine for P-38 units included explicit warnings against high-speed dives from altitude. Pilots were instructed to limit dive speeds and avoid prolonged vertical descents. This restriction hampered the aircraft's effectiveness. In combat, particularly against German fighters over Europe, the ability to dive away from trouble or dive onto an enemy was often the difference between life and death. Lockheed engineers suspected they understood the problem. At high speeds, the airflow over the wings was reaching velocities where compressibility effects became significant. Air, normally treated as an incompressible fluid in aerodynamic calculations, actually compresses when forced to move at speeds approaching the speed of sound. This compression creates shock waves, regions where air properties change abruptly. These shock waves alter the pressure distribution over the wing, destroying lift in some areas and creating turbulent flow that buffets the aircraft. Most critically, shock waves on the horizontal stabilizer could eliminate the tail's ability to generate the downward force needed to raise the nose and pull out of a dive. The phenomenon was called compressibility burble in the engineering literature of the time, though pilots had less technical terms for it. Whatever the name, it was killing men, and it needed to be solved. Lockheed's proposed solution was a set of electrically actuated dive recovery flaps installed on the lower surface of the wing. When activated, these flaps would disturb the airflow in a way that, in theory, would counteract the compressibility effects and restore control authority. The P-38 that Gilkey flew that morning was equipped with these experimental flaps. His job was to find out if they worked. He would discover something far more significant. In December of 1944, the sound barrier was not yet a conquered frontier. It was barely even understood as a problem that might have a solution. The speed of sound, approximately 760 miles per hour at sea level and decreasing with altitude, represented what many aerodynamicists considered an absolute limit for conventional aircraft. The term sound barrier itself reflected this pessimism. It was not merely a speed threshold. It was conceived as a wall, a point beyond which the familiar rules of flight would cease to apply. The concern was rooted in solid physics. Sound travels through air as a pressure wave, a disturbance that propagates at a finite speed determined by the air's temperature and density. An aircraft flying slower than the speed of sound sends pressure waves ahead of itself. Air molecules pushed aside by the approaching aircraft have time to move out of the way. But as an aircraft approaches the speed of sound, it begins to catch up with its own pressure waves. The air ahead has less and less time to react to the approaching disturbance. At the speed of sound, an aircraft is moving exactly as fast as the pressure waves it creates. The waves cannot move ahead to warn the air of the aircraft's approach. Instead, they pile up, forming a shock wave, a wall of compressed air where pressure, temperature, and density change abruptly. Behind the shock wave, the airflow is subsonic. Ahead of it, the aircraft is moving supersonically relative to the still, undisturbed air. The region between about 8 to 5% and 115% of the speed of sound came to be called the transonic region, and it was understood to be extraordinarily dangerous. In this regime, some parts of the aircraft might experience subsonic flow, while others experience supersonic flow. Shock waves form and move across surfaces. The center of pressure on a wing, the point where lift effectively acts, can shift dramatically and suddenly. Control surfaces might lose effectiveness entirely or behave in unexpected ways. Wind tunnel experiments in the 1930s and early 40s had documented these effects on small models. Researchers at facilities like the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, Langley Memorial Aeronautical Laboratory in Virginia, observed that as models approached Mach 1, the speed of sound expressed as a ratio of the model's speed to the local speed of sound, drag increased dramatically. Lift became unpredictable. In some cases, models were torn apart by the forces. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. These observations led to dire predictions. Some engineers calculated that an aircraft attempting to exceed the speed of sound would require exponentially more thrust to overcome the drag rise. Others worried that control surfaces would become useless, leaving the pilot unable to maneuver or recover from unusual attitudes. Still others feared that structural loads would exceed what any practical airframe could withstand. The sound barrier began to be spoken of in absolute terms, not as a challenge to be overcome, but as a fundamental limit to flight speed. By 1944, military aircraft were increasingly encountering the edges of this forbidden region, not intentionally, but as a consequence of war's demands. High-altitude combat required aircraft capable of flying above 30,000 feet, where German bombers operated. But at those altitudes, in air thin and cold, the speed of sound was much lower than at sea level, around 660 miles per hour. An aircraft diving from high altitude could accelerate rapidly, reaching speeds that represented a significant fraction of the local speed of sound, even if the indicated airspeed, the speed shown on the pilot's instruments, was relatively modest. P-38 pilots were among the first to encounter these effects operationally. The aircraft's clean aerodynamics and powerful engines made it capable of high dive speeds. Its straight wing and conventional tail design, state-of-the-art for the late 1930s when it was designed, were not optimized for transonic flight because transonic flight was not yet a consideration. The combination was dangerous. Pilots found themselves losing control in circumstances they didn't understand, dying for reasons that crash investigators could barely explain. Lockheed knew they had a problem. The dive recovery flaps were one attempt at a solution, a brute force method to disrupt the airflow and restore control without fully understanding the underlying aerodynamics. But the company also knew they needed better data. They needed to know exactly what happened to a P-38 inches, a high-speed dive. They needed measurements, observations, and most critically, they needed a pilot skilled enough and lucky enough to survive the experiment and report back. Major Signer Gilkey, climbing through 30,000 feet that December morning, was about to provide that data. He was about to take an aircraft designed for 390 miles per hour, maximum level speed, and push it to 412 miles per hour in a screaming vertical dive. He was about to experience Mach 0.81, 81% of the speed of sound, closer to the barrier than any American military pilot had deliberately flown and survived to document, and he was about to discover that the sound barrier, while real and dangerous, was not necessarily absolute. The war had created the need. The aircraft existed. The pilot was in position. All that remained was the dive itself. The P-38 Lightning's high-speed dive problem was not discovered in a single dramatic incident. It emerged gradually through a pattern of accidents that began in 1942 and accelerated through 1943 and 44 as the aircraft saw increasing combat service at high altitudes over Europe. Each crash added another data point to a growing body of evidence that something fundamental was wrong with the aircraft's behavior at high speeds. The first documented case occurred over North Africa in early 1943. A P-38 pilot pursuing a German reconnaissance aircraft initiated a dive from 28,000 feet. Witnesses on the ground reported seeing the Lightning enter a nearly vertical descent, accelerating rapidly. The aircraft never pulled out. It struck the desert floor at an angle estimated at 70 degrees, creating a crater 30 feet deep. The impact was so violent that investigators could barely identify the wreckage as having once been an aircraft. The pilot's body, when recovered, showed no evidence of having attempted to bail out. The parachute was still packed. The canopy was closed. This suggested the pilot had been either unconscious or unable to escape, but medical examination ruled out hypoxia or other physiological causes. The conclusion, disturbing to those who reviewed it, was that the pilot had remained conscious and at his controls throughout the dive, but had been physically unable to recover the aircraft or abandon it. Similar incidents followed with increasing frequency. In May of 1943, 2 P-38 seconds were lost in diving accidents over Sicily within a single week. In August, a P-38 dove into the English Channel during a training flight, killing an experienced pilot who had survived 27 combat missions. By the end of 1943, the Army Air Forces had documented at least 17 P-38 losses attributed to unrecoverable high-speed dives. The number of unreported or misdiagnosed cases was likely higher. Pilots began sharing information informally. In ready rooms and officers' clubs, P-38 pilots traded warnings about the dive problem. Don't chase a German fighter down from altitude. Don't try to dive away from trouble if you're above 25,000 feet. If you feel the controls getting heavy in a dive, throttle back immediately and accept that you might lose your target. These were not official tactics. They were survival techniques passed pilot to pilot, based on the experiences of men who had encountered the problem and lived. The Army Air Forces and Lockheed took the problem seriously. In October of 1943, Lockheed test pilot Tony LaVia conducted a series of deliberate high-speed dives at the company's facility in Burbank, California. LaVia was one of the most experienced test pilots in the country, with thousands of hours in experimental aircraft. His job was to reproduce the dive problem under controlled conditions and gather data about exactly what was happening. LaVia's test flights confirmed what operational pilots had reported. At speeds above 350 miles per hour, in a dive from high altitude, the P-38 exhibited severe nose-down pitch that could not be corrected with normal control inputs. The elevator, the horizontal surface at the tail that controls pitch, lost effectiveness. Pulling back on the control yoke produced almost no change in the aircraft's attitude. The nose remained pointed down, the dive continued to steepen, and the speed continued to increase. LaVia documented that control forces increased dramatically as speed built. At 300 miles per hour, pulling the yoke required perhaps 20 pounds of force. At 350 miles per hour, it required 60 pounds. At 380 miles per hour, LaVia was pulling with both hands with all his strength and achieving minimal response. He calculated that at 400 miles per hour, the forces would exceed what any pilot could physically generate. Most significantly, LaVia observed that recovery became possible only at lower altitudes. On several test flights, he held the dive until passing below 15,000 feet, where the denser air and higher local speed of sound reduced the Mach number even though the indicated airspeed remained high. At these lower altitudes, control authority gradually returned. The yoke would begin to respond. The nose would slowly rise. Recovery was possible, though it required every bit of the pilot's strength and consumed thousands of feet of altitude. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. LaVia's flights were terrifying experiences that he later described as the most dangerous work of his career. On one flight, he descended to within 3,000 feet of the ground before regaining control. On another, the G-forces during the pullout were so extreme that he temporarily blacked out, regaining consciousness to find the aircraft in level flight, with the control yoke still pulled full back against the stops. He had apparently maintained the pull pressure even while unconscious, his body's muscle memory completing the recovery without conscious thought. The data Levier brought back was invaluable. Lockheed engineers could now quantify the problem. The issue occurred at speeds above approximately Mach 0.67 or 67% of the speed of sound. At these speeds, localized regions of supersonic flow formed over the wing's upper surface. These supersonic patches created shock waves, thin boundaries where the air abruptly slowed back to subsonic speed. The shock waves disrupted the smooth flow of air over the wing, creating turbulence and changing the pressure distribution. Most critically, the disturbed airflow from the wing struck the horizontal stabilizer, the tail surface that generates the downward force needed to raise the nose. The turbulent air destroyed the stabilizer's ability to create lift. Without lift from the stabilizer, the pilot's control inputs had no effect. The aircraft was aerodynamically locked into its dive, trapped by forces that 1930s aerodynamic theory had not predicted, and that the P-38's designers had never considered. By early 1944, Lockheed had designed a potential solution to the compressibility problem. Engineers proposed installing small flaps on the lower surface of the wing, just inboard of the engines. These dive recovery flaps, as they were designated, would be electrically actuated. When the pilot activated them during a high-speed dive, they would extend downward into the airflow, creating a disturbance that would, in theory, alter the shockwave pattern and restore smooth flow over the horizontal stabilizer. The concept was elegant but unproven. Wind tunnel tests suggested it might work, but wind tunnels of the era could not reliably simulate transonic conditions. The only way to know if the flaps would save lives was to test them in flight, which meant asking a pilot to deliberately enter the conditions that had already killed dozens of men, then activate an experimental system and hope it prevented the crash. The test program began in March of 1944 at Lockheed's Burbank facility. A P-38 Jules model, serial number 42-104080, was selected for modification. Technicians installed the dive recovery flaps, along with reinforced wing spars to handle the additional loads the flaps would create. The aircraft was instrumented with accelerometers to measure G-forces, airspeed sensors more accurate than standard instruments, and a recording camera that would photograph the instrument panel throughout the flight, creating a permanent record of the dive profile. The test pilot assigned to the program was Milo Burcham, a civilian employed by Lockheed who had been testing P-38 seconds since 1941. Burcham was 41 years old, ancient by the standards of fighter pilots, but his age brought experience and judgment. He had survived numerous emergency situations in experimental aircraft. He understood aerodynamics at an intuitive level. If anyone could evaluate the dive recovery flaps and survive the process, it was Burcham. The first test flight occurred on March 23, 1944. Burcham climbed to 30,000 feet over the Mojave Desert, established the aircraft in level flight, then pushed the nose over into a 45-degree dive. The airspeed built rapidly. At 320 miles per hour, Burcham felt the first symptoms of compressibility, a slight buffeting in the controls. At 350 miles per hour, the nose began to tuck downward on its own. At 370 miles per hour, the control yoke was heavy and barely responsive. Burcham activated the dive recovery flaps. Electric motors whirred, extending the flaps into the airstream. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The buffeting decreased. The heavy pressure on the control yoke lightened. Burcham pulled back, and the nose responded, rising slowly but definitely. The aircraft began to recover from the dive at 22,000 feet, with thousands of feet of altitude still remaining. The flaps worked. Over the following weeks, Burcham conducted additional test flights, each pushing slightly further into the envelope. He reached speeds of 390 miles per hour, approximately Mach 0.76 at altitude. Each time, the dive recovery flaps allowed him to regain control and pull out safely. The test camera recorded every flight, providing engineers with detailed data about control forces, G-loads, and the timing of the recovery. The success of the dive recovery flaps led to immediate action. The Army Air Forces ordered that all P-38 seconds in operational service be retrofitted with the modification. By June of 1944, modification kits were being shipped to squadrons in England, Italy, and the Pacific. Ground crews worked around the clock to install the flaps on operational aircraft. Pilots were briefed on the new system and its use. The results were measurable and immediate. Dive-related accidents among P-38 units dropped by more than 60% within 3 months of the modification program beginning. Pilots who had been avoiding high-speed tactics regained confidence in their aircraft. The P-38's effectiveness in combat improved, as pilots could once again use diving attacks without fear of losing control, but the dive recovery flaps were a solution to a symptom, not a cure for the underlying problem. They allowed pilots to recover from compressibility effects, but they did not eliminate those effects. The P-38 remained fundamentally limited by its straight wing and conventional tail design, both optimized for the subsonic speeds that were state-of-the-art when the aircraft was designed in the late 1930s. The P-38 compressibility crisis forced American aviation to confront a reality that many engineers had preferred to avoid. The speed of sound was not some distant theoretical limit, but an immediate practical barrier that was already affecting combat operations. Aircraft were routinely encountering transonic conditions in dives from high altitude, and pilots were dying because aerodynamic theory had not kept pace with aircraft performance. The evidence was undeniable. Crash investigations had recovered wreckage, showing that P-38 seconds were breaking up from aerodynamic loads, not mechanical failures. Wings were separating at the root, where shock-induced turbulence created alternating pressure loads that fatigued the structure. Horizontal stabilizers were sound torn from the fuselage, ripped away by forces that should not have existed according to conventional aerodynamic calculations. The aircraft were encountering a regime of flight that behaved according to different rules. Wind tunnel data, once engineers knew what to look for, confirmed the flight test observations. At Mach 0.67 and above, shock waves formed on the P-38's wing upper surface. These shock waves were visible in high-speed photographs, as faint lines where moisture in the air condensed due to the sudden pressure change across the shock. The shock waves moved position as Mach number increased, travelling aft along the wing and growing stronger. At Mach 0.75, the shock wave was strong enough to cause complete flow separation behind it, creating a turbulent wake that destroyed lift and generated enormous drag. The National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, the government research organization that would later become NASA, began coordinating research into transonic aerodynamics in late 1944. NACA engineers collected data from military flight test programs, including the P-38 dive tests, and from wind tunnel experiments at facilities around the country. A picture began to emerge of what actually happened to an aircraft in the Transonic region. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Transonic region, roughly Mach 0.8 to Mach 1.2, was characterized by mixed flow regimes. Some parts of the aircraft experienced subsonic flow, where pressure disturbances could propagate upstream and warn the air of the approaching surface. Other parts experienced supersonic flow, where pressure disturbances could only propagate downstream, creating shock waves. The boundary between these regions moved and shifted as speed changed, creating unstable and unpredictable aerodynamic forces. Control surfaces, designed to work in purely subsonic flow, behaved erratically in the transonic region. An elevator might be in subsonic flow while the wing it was attached to had supersonic flow on its upper surface. The shock wave from the wing would strike the elevator, destroying its effectiveness. Or the elevator itself might have a shock wave on its surface, changing its lift characteristics in ways the pilot could not anticipate. These effects made aircraft difficult or impossible to control. Most disturbing was the discovery that drag increased dramatically in the transonic region, rising to values 3 or 4 times higher than at subsonic speeds. This drag rise, called wave drag because it resulted from the energy needed to create shock waves, meant that enormous thrust would be required to accelerate through the transonic region. Some engineers calculated that existing aircraft engines could never produce enough thrust to overcome transonic drag, suggesting that the sound barrier might indeed be a practical limit for propeller-driven aircraft. But the P-38 test program, and similar programs with other aircraft types, had proven one crucial point. It was possible to survive transonic flight. Pilots had entered the transonic region accidentally in dives and had lived to report what happened. With proper design, proper understanding, and proper equipment, the transonic region could be navigated. The sound barrier was not an absolute wall. It was a severe challenge, but challenges could be overcome. This realization marked a turning point in aeronautical engineering. By 1945, NACA had established formal research programs into transonic and supersonic flight. The military services began planning for research aircraft specifically designed to explore high-speed flight, aircraft that would eventually include the Bell X-1 that Chuck Yeager would fly faster than sound in October of 1947. Wind tunnel facilities were upgraded to better simulate transonic conditions. Universities began training engineers in compressible flow aerodynamics, a field that barely existed before the war. The P-38 Lightning, an aircraft designed for entirely different purposes, had inadvertently become the research vehicle that cracked open humanity's understanding of transonic flight. Every pilot who survived a compressibility incident added to the body of knowledge. Every crash investigation that identified shockwave effects added another piece to the puzzle. Every test flight that pushed into the transonic region and returned with data brought engineers closer to understanding how to design aircraft that could safely exceed the speed of sound. The dive recovery flaps that saved P-38 pilots' lives were important, but they were less significant than the knowledge gained from understanding why the flaps were needed. That knowledge, extracted from terrifying dives over the Mojave Desert and combat incidents over Europe, would inform every high-speed aircraft designed for the next 2 decades. The sound barrier would fall in 1947, but the foundation for that achievement was laid by P-38 pilots who dove into the unknown and lived to describe what they found. The P-38 dive recovery flap program represented one of the few times during the Second World War that a critical aircraft deficiency was identified, understood, and corrected while the conflict still raged. By the summer of 1944, modification kits were reaching operational squadrons across all theatres. The installation process was relatively straightforward, requiring approximately 40 man-hours per aircraft. Ground crews became expert at the procedure, and within months, the majority of P-38 seconds in service had been retrofitted with the life-saving flaps. The impact on operational effectiveness was measurable and immediate. Fighter groups flying P-38 seconds over Europe reported increased confidence in engaging German fighters at high altitude. Pilots who had previously avoided diving tactics resumed using the vertical plane to their advantage. The 55th Fighter Group, operating from England, documented a 30% increase in confirmed kills during the 3 months following the installation of dive recovery flaps compared to the previous quarter. While multiple factors contributed to this improvement, squadron commanders specifically noted that pilots were more willing to pursue enemy aircraft through altitude changes. In the Pacific Theater, where P-38 seconds served as the primary long-range escort fighter, the modification proved equally valuable. The vast distances over water meant that mechanical reliability was paramount. A pilot who lost control in a dive over the Pacific had no airfield within gliding distance, no possibility of forced landing in friendly territory. The dive recovery flaps reduced one of the P-38's most dangerous failure modes, making the aircraft more suitable for the extended overwater missions that characterized Pacific operations. Individual pilots who had survived compressibility incidents before the modification became vocal advocates for the system. They understood, in visceral terms that engineers could only calculate, what it meant to lose control of an aircraft and feel it plunge toward Earth while their hands strained uselessly against immovable controls. The flaps gave them a tool to fight back against aerodynamic forces they could not otherwise overcome. Many credited the modification with saving their lives during subsequent combat missions. The broader aviation community took notice. By late 1944, Other aircraft manufacturers were examining their own designs for similar vulnerabilities. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, another high-altitude fighter, underwent testing to determine if it experienced comparable compressibility effects. The North American P-51 Mustang, with its laminar flow wing design, showed better high-speed characteristics than the P-38, but still exhibited control heaviness at speeds above Mach 0.7. The lessons learned from the P-38 program informed modifications and operational procedures for these aircraft as well. Test pilot Milo Burcham, whose skill and courage had validated the dive recovery flap design, continued testing P-38 seconds and other Lockheed aircraft through 1944. Tragically, he was killed in October of that year during a test flight of the P-80 Shooting Star, Lockheed's first jet fighter. The P-80 experienced an engine flameout at low altitude, and Burcham was unable to restart the engine or reach a suitable landing site. He was 41 years old. His death was a reminder that test flying, even of thoroughly engineered aircraft, remained among the most dangerous professions in aviation. Tony Levier, the other primary test pilot involved in the P-38 high-speed dive program, survived the war and enjoyed a long career as an experimental test pilot. He would go on to test the Lockheed XF-90 penetration fighter, the F-94 Starfire interceptor, and most famously, the U-2 reconnaissance aircraft, which he first flew in 1955. Levier rarely spoke publicly about the P-38 dive tests, maintaining the modest professionalism characteristic of test pilots of his generation. When asked about the experience decades later, he described it simply as necessary work that needed to be done by someone. The P-38 itself continued in service through the end of the war. Production ceased in August of 1945 with the Japanese surrender, after more than 10,000 examples had been built. The type was rapidly retired from first-line service in the post-war drawdown, replaced by more modern designs including jet fighters. By 1949, virtually all P-38 seconds had been scrapped or sold as surplus. A handful survived in museums, static reminders of the aircraft that had served with distinction but had also revealed the limits of 1930s aerodynamic understanding. The dive recovery flaps remained standard equipment on all P-38 variants produced after mid-1944. They were a permanent part of the aircraft's design, a visible modification that marked the difference between early production models and later, safer versions. For historians of aviation technology, the dive recovery flap represents a transitional moment, a bridge between the era when high-speed flight was poorly understood and the post-war period when transonic and supersonic aerodynamics became rigorous scientific disciplines. The P-38 compressibility crisis and its resolution carried implications far beyond a single aircraft type or even the immediate needs of wartime aviation. It represented a fundamental shift in how engineers understood high-speed flight and marked the beginning of serious, systematic research into transonic aerodynamics. The war had pushed aircraft performance to the edge of the transonic region, and the accidents, data, and solutions that emerged from that push laid the groundwork for the supersonic aviation that would define the post-war era. Before the P-38 incidents, compressibility effects were known primarily as theoretical concerns, mathematical predictions from fluid dynamics that had limited practical application. Most aeronautical engineers in the late 1930s and early 1940s worked exclusively with subsonic flow equations. The simplifying assumption that air was incompressible held true at speeds below about 300 miles per hour at sea level, which encompassed virtually all aircraft then flying. The idea that routine military operations would require understanding compressible flow seemed remote, a problem for future generations. The P-38 shattered that complacency. Here was an operational aircraft, designed and built using conventional methods, that routinely encountered conditions where the incompressible flow assumption failed, catastrophically. Pilots were dying not because the aircraft was poorly designed within its intended envelope, but because combat pushed it beyond that envelope into a regime its designers had never considered. The problem could not be dismissed as theoretical or postponed for future study. It demanded immediate solution. The response marked one of the first examples of what would later be called integrated testing, where flight test data, wind tunnel research, and theoretical analysis were combined to solve a problem that none could address individually. Flight tests revealed the problem and provided data about when and how it occurred. Wind tunnels, once engineers understood what conditions to simulate, showed the shockwave formation and flow separation that caused the control loss. Theoretical analysis, using the equations of compressible flow that had been developed earlier but rarely applied, explained why shock waves formed and predicted how design changes might mitigate their effects. This integrated approach became the standard methodology for high-speed aircraft development after the war. When the Bell X-1 research aircraft was designed to break the sound barrier, engineers applied lessons learned directly from the P-38 program. The X-1's thin, straight wing was chosen partly because wind tunnel tests showed it would delay shockwave formation compared to thicker airfoils. Its all-moving horizontal stabilizer, where the entire tail surface pivoted rather than just a hinged elevator, was designed to maintain control authority even when shock waves disrupted the airflow. These features addressed problems first identified through P-38 accidents and tests. The human cost of the P-38 compressibility crisis remained difficult to quantify precisely. Official records documented at least 37 P-38 seconds lost to unrecoverable high-speed dives during the war, with 37 pilots killed. But these figures certainly undercounted the true toll. Many accidents were attributed to other causes, pilot error, structural failure, or unknown factors, when compressibility might have been the actual culprit. Combat losses included dives that began as tactical maneuvers and ended in crashes, with no way to determine whether enemy action or compressibility was the primary cause. Each death represented not just a statistical casualty, but the loss of a highly trained pilot, a man who had survived months or years of training and combat, only to be killed by an aerodynamic phenomenon his instructors had never mentioned because they themselves did not understand it. The psychological impact on surviving pilots was significant. Many developed reluctance to dive from high altitude, a hesitation that could prove fatal in air combat, where decisiveness often meant survival. The dive recovery flaps restored confidence, but they could not erase the memory of comrades who had died before the solution existed. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The legacy of the P-38 program extended into the Cold War and beyond. When the United States Air Force and Navy began developing supersonic fighters in the 1950s, every aircraft underwent extensive transonic testing before operational deployment. The mistakes made with the P-38, deploying an aircraft without fully understanding its high-speed characteristics, would not be repeated. New fighter designs were tested at transonic speeds in wind tunnels, evaluated by experienced test pilots in carefully controlled flight programs, and cleared for operational service only after their behavior throughout the speed envelope was thoroughly documented. The institutional knowledge gained from the P-38 crisis shaped military aviation procurement for decades. Test pilot schools expanded their curricula to include transonic aerodynamics. Engineering programs at universities added compressible flow as a required course. Wind tunnel facilities were upgraded to accurately simulate transonic conditions, using techniques like slotted wall test sections that allowed shock waves to propagate without reflecting off tunnel walls. The entire infrastructure of high-speed aviation research grew from the recognition, forced by P-38 accidents, that speed was pushing aircraft into new and dangerous territory. The story of the P-38's encounter with the sound barrier carries a particular irony that becomes clear only in hindsight. The aircraft that inadvertently advanced humanity's understanding of transonic flight was, by the standards that would emerge just a few years later, entirely unsuited for high-speed flight. Its thick wing, designed for maximum lift at moderate speeds, was precisely wrong for transonic operations. Its conventional tail, with a hinged elevator behind a fixed horizontal stabilizer, was the configuration most vulnerable to shockwave-induced control loss. Its straight wing, mounted perpendicular to the fuselage, created strong shock waves at relatively low Mach numbers. Within 5 years of the war's end, aeronautical engineers understood that aircraft intended for transonic or supersonic flight required swept wings to delay shock wave formation, thin airfoils to reduce wave drag, and all-moving tail surfaces to maintain control authority. The P-38 had none of these features. It was a subsonic aircraft accidentally pushed into the transonic region by the demands of war. That it survived this push, that its pilots lived to report what they encountered, and that engineers devised solutions allowing it to operate safely in conditions it was never designed for, speaks to the adaptability of both the aircraft and the people who flew and maintained it. The morning of December 14, 1944, where this story began, now reveals itself as representative rather than unique. There was no single suicidal dive that broke the sound barrier or solved the P-38's problems. Instead, there were dozens of test flights, hundreds of combat incidents, and thousands of hours of engineering analysis, all contributing incrementally to understanding and eventually mastering transonic flight. The 412 miles per hour mentioned in sensational accounts represents not a documented record, but an approximation of the speeds various test pilots reached during the dive programs of 1944 and 45. The truth, less dramatic than legend but more significant, is that the sound barrier was not conquered in a single moment by a single pilot in a single aircraft. It was eroded gradually by the accumulated experience of many pilots, many engineers, and many aircraft types, all pushing against the limits of what was known and possible. The P-38 program was one chapter in this larger story, an important chapter because it came early and because the lessons learned were documented and shared widely, but a chapter nonetheless rather than the entire narrative. Major test pilots like Milo Burcham and Tony LaVia, along with the dozens of combat pilots who survived compressibility incidents and reported their experiences, deserve recognition not for breaking the sound barrier, but for something arguably more valuable, for systematically exploring the transonic region, documenting its dangers, and proving that those dangers could be survived and eventually overcome. They were not daredevils seeking records. They were professionals doing difficult, dangerous work because it needed to be done and because they had the skill to do it. The P-38 Lightning ended its service life as all military aircraft eventually do, replaced by more modern designs that incorporated lessons learned from its successes and failures. But its contribution to aviation extended beyond its combat record, beyond the tonnage of bombs it delivered or enemy aircraft it destroyed. The P-38 forced aviation to confront the reality that the speed of sound was not a distant theoretical problem, but an immediate practical barrier, and in doing so, it accelerated the research and development that would lead to supersonic flight. When Captain Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier in the Bell X-1 on October 14, 1947, 3 years almost to the day after the P-38 dive tests were concluding, he did so in an aircraft that incorporated every lesson learned from the P-38 program and from similar programs with other wartime fighters. The X-1's thin wing, all-moving tail, and rocket engine were direct responses to problems identified through P-38 accidents and tests. Yeager's flight was the culmination of a process that began when the first P-38 pilot lost control in a dive and the first engineer asked why. The sound barrier, that morning in December 1944, and for several years afterward, remained unbroken. But it was no longer mysterious. The P-38 program had illuminated it, mapped its edges, and identified the tools needed to eventually surpass it. In the final analysis, that contribution, the transformation of an invisible aerodynamic barrier into an understood engineering challenge, may have been the P-38's most lasting legacy. The pilots who dove their P-38 seconds into the transonic region, whether in planned tests or desperate combat maneuvers, were explorers of a different kind. They ventured not into geographic unknown, but into the unknown regions of flight itself, where the familiar rules no longer applied and survival depended on skill, strength, and fortune. Some did not return from that exploration. Those who did brought back knowledge that would reshape aviation. They proved that the sound barrier, intimidating as it was, stood not as an absolute limit to human ambition, but merely as the next challenge to overcome. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.